Cancel her rehab. Save the money. The words drifted through that hospital room as clearly as if someone had shouted them into my ear. My husband of 15 years leaned over my bed, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne. The one that used to make my heart skip, and now just made my stomach turn. Anyone walking past that door would have thought he was a devoted husband keeping vigil. Then my stepson Brandon, sitting in the chair beside him, answered, without even lowering his voice. The house on Tiervester Street? I'm turning it into a high-end Airbnb. The garage alone is bigger than some people's whole house. I lay there, perfectly still. A tear slid out of the corner of my eye and rolled sideways into my ear, and neither one of them noticed. Not because they weren't looking, because they had already stopped seeing me as a person who could be seen. They thought I couldn't hear them. They thought wrong. My name is Layla Montgomery. I am 57 years old, and until 3 days ago, I believed loyalty was the one thing in this world that always got paid back eventually. I was wrong. Before we get into the story, if you've ever given everything to someone and wondered whether they even noticed, stay with me. Because what happened to me in a hospital room on the 10th floor of Memorial Hermann, Texas Medical Center, is going to make you look at the people closest to you a little differently. And if you love a good family drama that ends with justice served warm, this one's for you. 3 days earlier, my life had looked like any other Tuesday. I'd gotten up at 6, same as always, made coffee in the kitchen of the house on Tiervester Street, the one with the wraparound porch and the swing that's been creaking since somebody's Eisenhower-era administration near enough. Cedric was still asleep. Brandon hadn't called in a week, which wasn't unusual. He called when he needed something, and lately he hadn't needed anything, which should have told me more than it did. I'd sat on that porch with my coffee, going over the foundation's quarterly numbers, half listening to a mockingbird arguing with itself in the magnolia tree, thinking about the gala coming up in a few months, thinking about nothing more dangerous than whether I had enough non-fat creamer for Betty next door, who was coming by later to complain, lovingly, about her grandson calling her ancient upright vacuum the old dragon again. That was the last ordinary morning I had. I didn't know it at the time. You never do. That evening on the 610 loop, a pickup truck ran a red light and hit my car so hard it rolled twice before it stopped. I don't remember the sound of the impact. I remember the rain on the windshield right before it happened. Soft and steady. The kind of rain that makes you turn the wipers up just one notch. Then, nothing. Then white light and voices that didn't belong to anyone I knew. When I came back, really came back, aware, present, listening. Nobody in that room knew it yet. The doctors called it a traumatic brain injury with a mild stroke during surgery. My body did not answer when I told it to move. My mouth would not form words. But my ears worked just fine. Now here I was, 3 nights later, unable to lift a finger, listening to the 2 men I had spent half my life building a family with divide up my house and my future, like I was already gone. They thought I hadn't heard a word. They thought I didn't understand what was happening around me. But they had no idea I remembered every single word. And I remembered 12 long years of silence that came before it. How much more had they already put in motion that I still didn't know about? Cedric didn't say those words because he was cruel by nature. He said them because somewhere underneath the tailored suit he had spent 15 years terrified of being ordinary, a man who needed my quiet competence to survive and hated himself for needing it. Cutting off my recovery wasn't really about money. It was about finally being the one who decided whether I got to exist in his life at all. Here's something I didn't understand yet, lying in that bed, but you should, so this doesn't feel like it came out of nowhere later. As my husband, with no advance directive on file and no conservatorship yet in place, Cedric was by default my next of kin for medical decisions. The house, the company, the foundation, all of that was protected in a trust. But whether I got physical therapy 3 times a week or not, that call, in that moment, was legally his to make. That's not a plot twist. That's just how the law works for a lot of married couples. And it's exactly why a whispered sentence like that one could actually cost me my recovery. That's the thing nobody tells you about betrayal. It rarely arrives loud. Most of the time, it arrives in a whisper, standing right over your bed while you're too broken to do anything but listen. Now, before we go further, I want you to understand something about me, because this wasn't the first time I'd given something and gotten silence in return. 12 years ago, when my mother passed, she left me one thing of real value: her life insurance payout. It wasn't a fortune, but it was everything she had. And when Cedric's company was drowning in debt that same year, I handed every dollar of it over without blinking. Because that's what a wife does, isn't it? She saves her husband. He looked at me afterward, said, "You're something else, you know that?" And that was it. He never brought it up again. Not once in 12 years. I told myself that's just how some men are, quiet with their gratitude. I told myself a lot of things. Lying in that hospital bed, listening to him plan my erasure like he was reading off a grocery list, I finally understood what that silence had actually been. A nurse came in to check my IV line. Her name tag read Savannah Ellis. She was young, maybe 35, with her braids pulled back neat and tight. The kind of neat that comes from a woman who takes pride in doing things right, even when nobody's watching. She adjusted the tubing, glanced at my chart, and then she looked at my face. Really looked. "I know that look," she said, so quiet only I could hear it. "You're awake in there, aren't you?" I blinked twice. Slow, deliberate. She didn't gasp. She didn't call for a doctor. She just nodded once, like she'd confirmed something she already suspected. "I'm not saying anything to anybody yet," she whispered. "This isn't a hospital matter. This is just me and you and what I saw with my own eyes." Then she leaned in even closer, her voice dropping to barely a breath. "2 days after the accident, your husband asked one of the doctors about long-term care facilities. I saw the note in your file. He told them he was just looking into options. 2 days. Not 2 weeks of grief and fear and hoping I'd wake up. 2 days, and he was already shopping for a way to put me somewhere and move on." I blinked at Savannah again. A different signal this time. One she seemed to understand without needing it explained. "Don't tell them I'm awake. Not yet. Not any of them." She didn't ask why. She just nodded, quiet and steady, like a woman who'd already decided which side of this she was standing on. Savannah became the only bridge I had to the outside world. The nights on that floor had a rhythm of their own. The hiss of the oxygen concentrator, the far-off squeak of a supply cart's bad wheel, the vending machine down the hall that hummed a half-tone lower than it should have. I learned all of it, lying still, the way you learn a house by its creaks. Savannah moved through that rhythm like she belonged to it, unhurried, even at 3 a.m., her sneakers making almost no sound on the linoleum. She had a habit of talking to me the way you'd talk to someone fully awake, adjusting my pillow and murmuring, "Gonna be a little cold, hun," before she ever touched the blood pressure cuff. Small kindnesses she extended to a woman she still at that point believed couldn't hear a word of it. She found out almost by accident that I had learned sign language decades ago, back when my younger sister lost her hearing after a childhood illness. I was 19 then, and I remember the exact week I decided to learn it, not out of duty, but out of a fierce, almost frightened need to make sure my sister never once felt like the family had quietly moved on without her. We used to sit on the back steps of our parents' house and sign nonsense to each other, just to make each other laugh. The two of us doubled over silently while our mother hollered from the kitchen window that dinner was getting cold. My sister has been gone 11 years now, but the language stayed in my hands, the way a hymn stays in your chest long after the choir stops singing. I hadn't used it in years. I hadn't needed to. Until I did. One afternoon, with my fingers still stiff and trembling, aching like they'd been asleep for 100 years, I managed to form my first real word since the accident. Lawyer. Savannah's eyes went wide and then, just as quickly, calm. I watched something settle behind them, not fear, something closer to resolve. The look of a woman recalculating exactly how far she was willing to go for a patient she'd known less than a week. She didn't ask questions. She made a phone call instead, stepping just outside my door, and through the gap, I caught only fragments of her voice, low and urgent. No, tonight, before his shift starts. I lay there, memorizing the ceiling tiles, counting the water stains shaped like Texas above the window, and thought, for the first time since the crash, maybe. Dominic Lawson arrived the next morning before Cedric and Brandon had even had their coffee. I heard him before I saw him, the particular weight of a man's dress shoes on hospital tile. Unhurried, deliberate. Nothing like the soft-souled scramble of nurses. He'd been my lawyer and my friend for 25 years, since back when I was a young woman with more ambition than money, trying to build something that would outlast me. Back then, he'd worked out of a one-room office above a dry cleaner's on Alameda Road, and he used to tell me, half joking, that he'd represent me for free the day I finally made my first million because he wanted the bragging rights. He never once made me pay full price after that, not even now. He pulled a chair to my bedside, opened a legal pad, and waited. The pen hovered a second before he clicked it, an old habit I'd later learned from decades of depositions, never writing a word until the room had gone quiet enough to trust. I told him everything through slow, careful signs and 2 blink confirmations. Each sign cost me something my hands still fought me on the simplest shapes, and twice I had to stop my palm trembling flat against the blanket and just breathe until the tremor passed. Dominic never rushed me. He wrote every word down like it was scripture, and once, when my hand slipped and formed the wrong letter, he simply waited, pen still, until I corrected it myself. Then he checked something on his laptop right there at my bedside and let out a breath I felt more than heard. "Layla," he said quietly, "almost everything is still protected. The development company, the house on Tiervester, the scholarship fund, it's all sitting inside the Montgomery Family Trust. You set that up before you two even got married. Cedric only has access to the small joint checking account. That's it. Whatever else he's got going on financially, it's not coming out of anything that belongs to this family." 12 years of quiet planning, back before I ever imagined I'd need protecting from my own husband, had built me a wall he didn't even know was there. Dominic flipped back a page in an old file he'd brought along, and his expression changed, that particular stillness of a man reading something he already half remembered, but hadn't expected to matter again. "3 years ago," he said, "Cedric filed a request to be added to the trust as co-trustee. You turned him down in writing." I didn't remember the specifics, but I remembered the mood in the house for weeks afterward. The slammed cabinet doors, the silences at dinner, the way he'd bring up trust and partnership out of nowhere, and then go quiet when I didn't take the bait. I remembered, too, a detail I hadn't thought worth keeping until just then. The week after I turned him down, Cedric started working late on Thursdays. Every Thursday, like clockwork. And I'd told myself it was the Riverside project running behind schedule. I understood now exactly what that had been about. Or at least I understood there was more to it than a project deadline. That thread I didn't pull yet. I didn't even know it was there to pull. There's something else you should know before we move on any of this, Dominic added. The moment we act, he'll know we're on to him, and anything he hasn't already hidden, he'll hide fast. Whatever we find from here on, we hold. We build the case first. We go to the district attorney when it's airtight, not a day before. I signed back one word. Understood. For a moment after he left, the room went quiet in the way it hadn't in days. No whispered plotting, no monitors beeping out of rhythm with my pulse, just afternoon light through the blinds, laying pale stripes across the blanket. I lay there and let myself feel, for the first time since the crash, something other than grief or fury. It was smaller than hope. It was more like the feeling of a woman standing at the top of a staircase, in the dark, finally finding the railing with her hand. Dominic brought in a private investigator 2 days later. Her name was Ariel Bishop, sharp-eyed, quiet-footed, the kind of woman who notices which way a room is facing before she even sits down. She wore flat shoes that made no sound at all, and when she shook my hand, gently aware of the IV line taped to the back of it, her grip was brief and businesslike. A woman who'd clearly learned a long time ago not to waste a client's energy on pleasantries. Within a week, she came back with something. Cedric and Brandon had met with the real estate broker 4 separate times. They'd walked buyers through the house on Tierwester Street while I was lying in a hospital bed 4 miles away. Ariel had more. She'd recovered old text messages from Brandon's work phone. 8 months before the accident, 8 months, Brandon had written to his father. Once she actually decides to retire, everything gets a lot easier. Cedric had responded with a single laughing emoji. They'd been talking about my retirement long before any truck ever ran a red light. I lay in that bed and let a memory surface, one I hadn't let myself think about in years. Brandon, 22, halfway through a certification program he swore would finally get his career moving. Cedric, telling me the company was tight that quarter, couldn't spare a dime. Me, quietly selling my mother's wedding bracelet, the first piece of gold jewelry she ever owned, without telling a soul, so Brandon wouldn't have to drop out. Brandon never knew. Cedric never thanked me. He probably forgot the conversation ever happened. I thought too about the boy Brandon had been before all of that. 9 years old, the summer after Cedric and I married, following me around the kitchen, asking if he could call me something other than Layla. Settling finally on Miss L because stepmom felt too formal, and mom felt like a betrayal of a mother he barely remembered. I used to think that boy was still in there somewhere, underneath the man now planning which walls to knock down in my house. Lying in that bed, I wasn't sure anymore whether I believed that because it was true or because I needed it to be. One evening, while Savannah was fleshing my IV line, she said something I hadn't expected. My grandmother went through something similar, she said, not quite looking at me, her eyes on the tubing. Not exactly this, but a family that decided she was already gone before she was. I was 12. I remember exactly how it felt to be the only one in the room who still saw her as a person. She clicked the line shut and finally met my eyes. That's part of why I do this job. So I want you to know this isn't charity, what I'm doing. It's not even really about you specifically. It's about not being 12 again, watching it happen, and not being able to do anything. I couldn't answer her with anything but my eyes, but I hope she understood what I was trying to say back. At night, once the hallway lights dimmed and the monitors settled into their rhythm, Maurice Grant would slip in. Savannah trusted him completely, a physical therapist built like a linebacker, with the patience of a man twice his size. Session by session, in total secrecy, he worked my hands, my legs, my spine, every finger that twitched on command. Every second I held myself upright without shaking was a small, private victory that only 3 people on this earth knew about. Every bit of strength I clawed back meant their clock was running out, whether they knew it or not. But I still didn't know how far they'd already gone. If you were the one lying in that bed, would you have let Savannah in that fast? Or would you have kept everyone at arm's length a little longer? Ariel brought back an audio recording from a restaurant in Midtown Houston. I listened to it through Savannah's phone held close to my ear, so no nurse walking past would notice the volume turned so low I had to hold my breath to catch every word. And even then, the monitor beside my bed ticked up a few beats per minute, and Savannah's hand moved instinctively to the volume dial, like she could somehow protect me from what was coming through it. Cedric's voice warm with wine and something worse than confidence. Honestly, I thought she was gone that first night. Brandon laughing low. Doctor said recovery could take a month. Let's make sure it doesn't happen at all. I had heard my husband whisper about money. I had heard my stepson joke about real estate. This was the first time either of them had said out loud, in plain words, just how little they cared whether I lived or simply stopped fighting. The heart monitor beside me spiked hard enough that Savannah reached over and rested 2 fingers lightly on my wrist, not checking my pulse, steadying it the way you'd calm a spooked animal. "Breathe," she mouthed. I did. What Cedric couldn't say out loud, even to Brandon, was the fear underneath the wine and the cologne. The fear that, if I fully recovered, I would finally see him clearly, the way I was starting to see him now. Wanting me gone wasn't really about the house or the money. It was easier to erase me than to stand in front of a woman who might one day ask him to explain himself. Then, Ariel showed us something worse. Security footage from the home office on Tiervester Street dated the week after the crash. The footage was grainy, lit only by the desk lamp Cedric always left burning too late. And in it, he looked smaller than I remembered him. Shoulders hunched over the phone, one hand raking through his hair, in a gesture I recognized from 20 years of watching him lie to vendors on the phone about payment timelines. Cedric, alone, at night, saying to Brandon over the phone, voice flat as a closed door, "The sooner she's gone, the sooner we're free." There was more. Ariel pulled up hospital hallway footage from the first week, time-stamped just past midnight. Cedric standing outside my door photocopying a stack of papers. When she zoomed in, one line was legible. Request for conservatorship. He had started the paperwork to have me legally declared incompetent before any doctor had even given a final word on my recovery. Dominic explained what that meant in practice if a judge signed off on it. Cedric wouldn't just control my medical decisions anymore. He'd control everything, right down to whether I was allowed visitors. Dominic set his laptop down slowly on the rolling tray table, and for a moment, none of us said anything. Somewhere down the hall, a cartwheel squeaked past, ordinary and oblivious, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the whole world kept moving at its normal volume, while mine had just gone entirely silent with fear. "If that had gone through," Dominic said, finally quiet, "I want you to understand exactly what it would have meant. Not just medical decisions. He could have moved you, sold things, restructured the foundation's board, all of it, with a judge's signature and nobody left in the room to say no." He looked at me steadily. That's how close this was. I signed one thing back, slow and deliberate, so there'd be no mistaking it. How close. Days, Ariel said. Maybe a week if the judge he'd lined up moved as fast as the paperwork suggested he would. I lay there and let that land, not as fresh panic, but as something colder and more useful. Fear, I was learning, could either flood you or sharpen you. And I decided right there, under those fluorescent lights, which one I was going to let it do. They'd already reserved a funeral home. They'd already contacted a bargain rate nursing facility on the outskirts of the city. Savannah showed me a draft agreement Ariel had found. The plan was to move me straight from the hospital into that facility, while the foundation's board was asked to temporarily hand full operating control to Cedric, due to the chairwoman's health. It wasn't just that they wanted me gone. They wanted to erase every trace of my authority while I was still breathing. I thought staring at that document about every scholarship kid whose tuition ran through that foundation, a girl named Destiny I'd met at the gala 2 years back, the first in her family bound for nursing school, who'd hugged me so hard at the check presentation she'd nearly knocked the microphone off the podium. If Cedric took that board seat, even temporarily, I had no idea what would happen to kids like her. That thought scared me more than anything on the security footage had. It wasn't just my house or my name anymore. It was every promise I'd made to people who were counting on me to still be the woman who kept them. That night, as Savannah gently wiped my face with a warm cloth, I let myself remember something I'd buried for years. All those evenings I sat alone at the kitchen table, doing the books, while Cedric and Brandon watched basketball in the next room. One night, Brandon had turned to a friend and said, loud enough for me to hear from the hallway, "She's only good for keeping house." Cedric had laughed. He never corrected him. There was another memory sitting right behind that one I hadn't let myself look at directly in years. A dinner, maybe 5 years back, when I'd mentioned carefully, lightly, the way you test water before stepping in, that I'd once turned down a partnership offer at a real estate firm in Dallas to stay in Houston after we married. Cedric had laughed, not unkindly on the surface, and said, "Good thing, too. You'd have been in over your head up there." I remembered how quickly I'd laughed along with him, how easily I'd let the comment slide past, instead of asking myself why a man who claimed to love me needed to make my sacrifice sound like a favor to me, instead of one I'd given him. Ariel mentioned something else that night, almost in passing, the kind of detail investigators note out of habit rather than urgency. Going through the foundation's expense records for anything tied to Cedric, she'd flagged one recurring business account withdrawal that didn't match any project on the books. Small monthly, filed under a vague line item marked consulting. "Probably nothing," she said, closing her laptop. "Development guys bury all kinds of things under consulting. I'll keep an eye on it." I didn't think much of it at the time. None of us did. It would be weeks before that probably nothing turned into something that mattered more than anything else in this whole story. I looked at Savannah, then at Dominic standing quietly by the window, the streetlights outside just starting to hum on for the evening, and I raised my hand and signed 2 words with as much steadiness as I could manage. Not yet. Dominic understood before I even finished the second sign. "We have enough right now to end this quietly," he said. "But quiet isn't justice. If we go to the DA today, this becomes a private plea deal nobody outside a courtroom ever hears about. I want it documented so thoroughly that when it comes out, there's no version of the story where they get to call it a misunderstanding." I nodded. For the first time since the crash, I felt something besides grief. I felt patience, the kind with teeth. This wasn't just a family drama anymore. This was a case being built, brick by brick, in complete silence. 10 weeks is a long time to keep a secret in a house where every door creaks and every hallway has a camera pointed at it for security. Maurice worked me in the dead hours between the 2 a.m. vitals check and the 4 a.m. one, when the whole floor sounded like it was holding its breath. The overhead lights stayed dimmed to a bruised amber, so the night nurses wouldn't strain their eyes. And in that half-light, his hands were the only steady thing in the room, pressing my heel into the mattress, counting under his breath. Good. Again. Good. Like a man coaxing a stalled engine back to life, one cylinder at a time. I sweated through 2 hospital gowns some nights. I bit down on a folded washcloth so I wouldn't cry out and bring someone running. Nobody tells you that getting your body back is its own kind of violence, quieter than the accident, but just as total. What I didn't tell Dominic, not at first, was the other thing I'd started noticing in that amber light. Small things. The kind you only catch when you've got nothing to do but watch. Cedric's visits had thinned to 10 minutes, always in the evening now, always with his phone face down on the blanket, like it might say something he hadn't approved. Twice I caught the screen light up before he flipped it. A name saved simply as Work R. Once a receipt fell out of his jacket pocket when he leaned down to fake kiss my forehead for the benefit of a passing nurse. A bracelet, paid for in full, a style I would never in 15 years have chosen for myself. He picked it up so fast I almost believed I'd imagined it. I hadn't. I just didn't have a shape to put around it yet. I filed it away, the same place I filed everything else those days. A drawer in my mind marked later, when I can move my hands again. The flash drive changed the temperature of the room the night Savannah brought it to me. I remember the particular sound plastic makes sliding across a hospital tray table, small and cheap, and utterly unable to hold the weight of what was on it. Found it behind a loose panel in the safe, Dominic said, turning it over once in his fingers like he still couldn't quite believe it existed. Cedric's own housekeeper found the panel years ago, mentioned it once to your assistant in passing. Nobody ever thought to look again. When his voice came through the recording, "You think you're the one in charge here, but we both know who really decides things." I watched Savannah's jaw tighten in the dark, watched Dominic go very still and very quiet, the particular stillness of a man recalculating a case he thought he already understood. I had armed myself 5 years earlier and forgotten I'd done it. That thought sat strange in my chest, not triumph, not yet, just the cold, clean feeling of a door you didn't know was locked, finally swinging open. Ariel's update 3 nights before the gala came with none of her usual certainty. She stood at the foot of my bed with her arms crossed, weight rocking slightly heel to toe. A woman used to having answers and visibly unsettled by not having one. "It's not trust money," she said again, like repeating it might make the shape of it clearer. "It's his clean from the development company. Goes out the same week every month, small enough not to trip anything routed through an LLC that dead ends at a mail drop in the woodlands." I don't like patterns I can't explain, Layla. I've been doing this 11 years, and my gut says this one isn't finished. I told her to keep pulling the thread, but not to force it. Some things reveal themselves on their own schedule. I had learned that much already, lying still while the world moved around me. The night before the gala, Savannah helped me into the dress. I'd chosen navy, structured, nothing that begged for attention, and everything that commanded it. She fixed the clasp at my neck, and our eyes met in the mirror for a long moment, neither of us filled with words. "You don't owe them a grand entrance," she said finally. "You could do this in a lawyer's office with the blinds down." I told her the truth. I didn't need it for justice. I needed it because for 15 years, I had watched a room light up for Cedric's version of our marriage. And I wanted once to watch that same room see the truth in real time, together. so no one could later say they simply hadn't known. The grand ballroom at the Hilton Americas Houston was already loud with the particular hum of money and good manners when I reached the back doors, a string quartet threading something classical under 400 overlapping conversations, ice clinking in glasses, the low gold wash of chandelier light on marble. Cedric's voice carried from the podium, amplified and practiced thick with a sorrow he'd clearly rehearsed in a mirror. Layla wanted so badly to be here tonight, but her condition is still very serious. I could hear, even from the hallway, the murmur of sympathy rippling through the tables, the small sounds of people who believed him completely. Then the doors opened. I have replayed that first step more times than I can count. The cane meeting marble. One deliberate tap, and then the sound simply stopping, as if someone had lifted the needle off a record. 400 faces turned at once. I saw a woman near the front set her champagne flute down, without looking, missing the table entirely, catching it just before it fell. I saw Cedric's hand tighten on the podium edge until his knuckles went the color of the tablecloths. Brandon, in the front row, turned so fast his chair scraped the floor, loud enough to make a child 2 tables back flinch and grab her mother's sleeve. I walked forward, slow, steady. Each strike of the cane against that floor was the only sound in a room built to hold 400 people's worth of noise. Savannah and Dominic held their distance behind me, close enough to matter, far enough that this moment was unmistakably mine. Ariel was already at the sound booth, headset on one hand raised to the technician beside her. I understood walking across that floor that part of what I was about to do wasn't about Cedric at all anymore. It was about every woman in that room who had ever smiled through a marriage that was quietly hollowing her out and never had a night like this one to stand up in. I wasn't just reclaiming my name. I was showing them it could be done. The screen behind the stage lit up. Cancel her rehab. Save the money. Gasps low and immediate, rolling backward through the tables like a wave hitting a seawall. Then the restaurant audio. Then the hallway footage, time-stamped, damning. By the time Ariel stepped forward with the forged scholarship signatures, the room wasn't murmuring anymore. It was a held breath about to break. I took the microphone. My hand shook, but my voice, when it came, did not. If you were in that ballroom, watching a woman they'd been told was too broken to attend her own gala, walk the length of it, unassisted by anyone but herself, would you have believed the version of Cedric he'd spent 15 years building? Or the one on that screen? The days after the gala moved strangely fast. In the news cycle, agonizingly slow in my own body. Charges were filed. Reporters called the foundation's office so often that Dominic finally had the number changed. Through all of it, I kept going to physical therapy. Now in daylight, now with no need to hide it. And there was something almost funny about doing in the open what I'd spent 10 weeks doing in secret. Maurice grinned the first time a nurse walked by and simply waved instead of pretending not to notice. "Feels different when you're not sneaking," he said. I told him it felt like breathing after holding it too long. I agreed to see Cedric once more before it all became lawyers and depositions, 1 hour a neutral counselor's office on Richmond Avenue with beige walls and a white noise machine humming in the corner, loud enough to swallow anything either of us wasn't ready to have overheard. He was already seated when I came in, and I noticed, before anything else, that his suit didn't sit on him the way it used to, the shoulders a fraction too wide now, like the man inside it had actually shrunk. His hands folded on the table wouldn't stay still. He kept turning his wedding ring in slow half circles, a habit I'd watched him do for 15 years without ever once wondering what it meant. "You look well," he said, and it came out smaller than he probably intended. I didn't answer that. I set my own ring on the table between us instead, the sound of metal on wood louder than it had any right to be in that quiet room. Keep it, I said. It belongs to your memory now, not mine. He flinched, not dramatically, just a small tightening around the eyes, the look of a man hearing a door close somewhere he'd assumed would always be open to him. Layla, He stopped, started again. I know what I said in that hospital room. I know what you said too, I told him. I was there for all of it, every word. The white noise machine hummed on. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang twice and stopped. I forgive you, I said finally. Not because you deserve it. I forgive you so you don't get to control my life anymore. Not from a hospital bed, and not from wherever you end up next. He stood to leave. At the door he paused, with his hand on the frame, not quite turning back, and set it flat, almost bored, like a man setting down something he'd carried too long to feel its weight anymore. You think it all started with the accident. Truth is, I'd been tired of sharing anything with you for a long time before that. It wasn't an apology. It was the plainest thing he had ever said to me in 15 years of marriage. And somehow, the plainness of it hurt more than any of the recordings had. Brandon's letter came 2 weeks later from a court-ordered facility outside San Antonio. In handwriting I recognized from report cards and birthday cards decades old. The same slant, just heavier now, like the pen had been pressed harder than it needed to be. He didn't ask me to forgive him. He wrote about the 22-year-old version of himself I'd quietly bailed out of a certification program's tuition, and how he'd found out years later, from a comment Cedric made in passing, exactly whose money that had been. I never thanked you, he wrote, because by the time I understood what you'd actually given up, I'd already decided it was easier to think you owed us. I don't have a good reason for that. I just have that one. I read it twice, standing at my kitchen counter with the coffee going cold beside me. And then I folded it and put it in the drawer where I keep the things I'm not ready to answer yet, but not ready to throw away either. My sister flew in from New Orleans 4 days after the charges were filed and simply didn't leave for 3 weeks. She'd learned over the phone everything I hadn't been able to say out loud yet. Some things move easier through the hands than through the mouth. Even after all these years, even now that my voice had mostly come back. We sat on the back steps some evenings and signed to each other the way we had as girls, not because either of us needed to, but because it felt like the last honest language left in the house. She made gumbo the way our mother used to, filled the whole kitchen with the smell of it, and for the first time in months, the house on Tierwester Street sounded like something other than an argument. I was losing. Justice had been done, or was on its way to being done, in the careful, grinding way the law does these things. But the house felt too big now, and too cold in a way no amount of daylight fixed. Winning, I was learning, didn't mean the hurting simply stopped on schedule. Before I sold the house on Tiervester Street, I went back one last time, alone, on the Sunday morning when the movers weren't due until noon. The porch swing still had its old creak, the one that had been going since somebody's Eisenhower-era administration near enough. And I sat in it for a long while, without pushing off, just letting my own weight settle into the quiet. Sunlight came through the magnolia the way it always had, dappled and unbothered, like the tree had no idea what had happened inside that house. I walked the rooms one by one before I left the kitchen table, where I'd done the books alone while the television played basketball 2 rooms over. The hallway, where Brandon once said, loud enough to be heard, that I was only good for keeping house. I didn't cry in any of those rooms. I think I'd already done my crying, in pieces, over the months it took to get here. I just said a quiet goodbye to the version of me who used to live there, the one who thought loyalty always got paid back eventually, and I closed the door behind her gently, like you would for someone finally asleep. The new place near Herman Park is smaller, and the porch faces east instead of west, which means I get the sunrise instead of the sunset. I chose that on purpose. Mornings, not endings. The Foundation's relaunch event was smaller than the gala, held in a community center instead of a ballroom, folding chairs instead of gilded ones, and it suited what we were actually building far better than any chandelier ever had. A large portion of the funding now goes to long-term rehabilitation care for older Black women without adequate insurance, women who, I'd learned the hard way, are so often assumed capable of enduring anything precisely because everyone around them has decided they always have. I asked Savannah to stand beside me on the small stage, and she came up, smoothing her blazer, visibly uncomfortable with the attention, glancing sideways at me, like she still expected someone to tell her this wasn't her moment to have. The person who saved me wasn't family by blood. I told the room, my voice steadier now than it had been in months. It was someone who kept asking me what I wanted when the whole world had already decided I had nothing left to want. Savannah's eyes went bright, and she looked down at her hands, and I reached over and took one of them, and we stood like that a moment longer than the applause strictly required. 3 weeks after the criminal case closed, Dominic called me into his office on the Thursday afternoon, and I knew before I sat down that it was something. He had that particular stillness lawyers get when they've confirmed something they were hoping wouldn't be true. Ariel had finally traced the transfer she'd flagged the night of the gala, the one that had nagged at her for months like a splinter she couldn't quite locate. It wasn't trust money, and it never had been. It was Cedric's own company revenue, routed out through a shell of his development business, completely separate from anything I'd ever controlled or even known existed. Over 2 years, he had quietly moved more than $400,000 into an account belonging to a woman who had been photographed beside him at private business gatherings I was never invited to. The same initial, I understood then, sitting perfectly still in Dominic's office chair, that I'd once glimpsed on a phone screen in a dimmed hospital room, and told myself meant nothing. Cedric didn't build that second life out of pure greed. He built it because, somewhere along the way, being seen as a hero to a new woman felt easier than being seen honestly by the wife who already knew every one of his weaknesses. His fear was never really about money. It was about being fully known and found wanting. I didn't cry not that afternoon either. I sat with it a long moment, turning it over the way you'd turn over a stone to see what's living underneath. And then I said to Dominic quietly, so it wasn't just that he stopped loving me. He'd already started loving someone else, while I was still trying to earn it. I asked that the statements be made part of the public civil record, not for more revenge, but so no one could ever again file what he did under the heading of a momentary lapse in judgment. I started keeping a journal every morning on my new porch coffee going lukewarm beside me, the park still gray-blue before the sun fully clears the tree line. On the first page I wrote, I used to think loyalty always gets repaid. Now I know, loyalty is only beautiful when it's given to the right person. I gave mine for too long to people who didn't deserve it. From now on, I give it to myself. I sit here most mornings now, watching the sun come up slow over Herman Park. No more hatred left in me. Just the particular quiet that comes after you finally let go of everything that was never real to begin with. Whatever family drama comes next in this life, I plan to meet it with my eyes wide open. This story reminds us that dignity doesn't come back all at once. It comes back in small, deliberate choices, the kind you can actually make this week. If you're the one still holding a marriage or a family together, mostly on your own, start with one folder. Put your will, your account numbers, and your lawyer's name in one place, and tell one person you trust exactly where it is. If someone in your family talks about you like you're not in the room, say so plainly, once, the same day, not months later, when it's built up into something bigger than the moment deserved. Call the friend you've been meaning to call. Today, not one of these days. If you're widowed or living alone and a week goes by without a real conversation, that's the week to invite someone over for coffee, not wait for them to ask first. And if you've already given someone every chance to treat you right and they haven't taken it, you're allowed to stop offering, not out of bitterness, but because your peace was never supposed to be the price of someone else's comfort. That's not immoral. That's just Tuesday morning wisdom, the kind worth keeping close.